Welcome to the 2018 Annual FACCT Conference guest speakers presentation by Krisanne Hall. We hope this presentation is a blessing to you today.
Constitutional lawyer. I travel around the country. I don't practice law anymore. I was a prosecutor here in Florida for about 10 years. I worked with the Christian Law Association for a few years doing First Amendment law as well. But now what I do is I travel around the country. I teach the Constitution. My husband and I have a radio show that podcasts Monday through Thursday. We are nationally syndicated. On our Saturday, we have a show every Saturday as well. My husband and I pastored a church for about 10 years. We are now missionaries. We just finished about a 4-year mission term in Haiti. And now we are involved with a mission group called Global Impact Ministries International, GIMI.org. I think it's .org. It might be .com. My brain has just slipped. But anyway, what we do at Global Impact is we are missionaries to the missionaries. So what we do is we supply aid and other kinds of supplies to missionaries in the field. And that's all over the country, both foreign and domestic. Right now we have a mission in, a particular mission in Panama City, Florida. We're helping to rebuild a boys' home after the hurricane. So if you're interested in knowing about that, it's Global Impact Ministries International. But I'm here today to teach you on the Constitution side. We are going to talk today about religious liberty. I have up there the information for the radio show because that's what we do every day. We take current events that you hear in the news or you see in the papers, and we bring them to you from an historical, constitutional, and biblical perspective. So we have a unique way of teaching. We're not a talk show, we're a teach show. And so this is, if you are interested in what we have to teach today and you want to continue this kind of learning, then you can do that through the radio show. But we're here today to talk about religious liberty in America. Religious liberty in America is not an invention of Americans. It is something that came to the forefront in America through an historical journey. Thomas Jefferson, our third president of the United States, he's also the drafter of our first foundational document, the Declaration of Independence. And he says, "The God who gave us life gave us liberty. And how can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm foundation? A conviction that these liberties are a gift from God." Now, Jefferson goes on to say, "I tremble for my nation, because I know we serve a just God, and His justice will not sleep forever." Jefferson was trying to explain our duty to this liberty, not just simply as an ideology or a theory or a theology, but a duty as a gift from God. We all know to whom much is given, much is required. And so that's why we're here to learn about this religious liberty. Today, our course objectives are going to be, where do we get our principles of religious liberty in America? There's a lot of debate over things like that, a lot of discussion, but I'm here to tell you that there really is no debate. It's something that is set in fact, in history, that is easily discernible, especially in a day and age when you have thousands of years of documentation right here in your hand. What we have to do as Americans is stop listening to the experts and start becoming a learned people ourselves. Because what we've been taught for a very long time in America is simply so far from resembling truth that you could even call it a misdirection or even a deception and a lie. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some history. We're going to learn why government should not have a power to control religion. We're going to learn about the proper notation, the proper understanding of this phrase, a Christian nation. We're going to talk about how does government aid damage our mission in the gospel? And then finally, how do we preserve religious liberty for our future? Which should be the primary goal in our minds, because that's the foundation upon which America was built. Our Constitution's preamble says the whole purpose of creating our Constitution and our Union is to preserve the blessings of liberty, not just to ourselves, but to our posterity. What we know today affects the future. I believe that's why God said, to whom much is given, much is required. Because although He has given it to us, we have a duty to not just simply preserve it, but to prosper it. May I remind you of the parable of the talents? What was the message of the parable of the talents? The whole message was, it's not good enough for you to just simply preserve what the master has given you. Because that's what the first servant did, right? He buried it in the ground. It didn't degrade. We weren't told that it was damaged in any way. And as a matter of fact, the servant said, here is what you gave me. And the master was not happy about that, was he? He called him a wicked and slothful servant. So from that parable, Jesus teaches us that when the Master gives us a gift, He doesn't expect us to simply hoard it for ourselves. He expects us to prosper it for His purpose and His kingdom. How many of you believe that liberty is a gift from God? Along with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, the founders of our America, they believed that too. But how can you prosper something if you don't know what it is? How do you defend something if you can't define it? So we're going to look at these things from an historical perspective. This is Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry gave a very famous speech. He said, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? Anybody here actually read the entire speech? Well, you can, and I suggest you go read it online, because this is also what he says in that speech. He says, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." God gave us history. I mean, have you ever thought about what a miraculous thing your memory is? That is a gift from God. Do you know there are people who have been injured who don't have memory? There's a condition, a degrading neurological condition that causes people to lose their memory, like every 12 minutes. What kind of life do you have if every 12 minutes you're learning something new? God gave us history to be our greatest teacher. Isn't that what we're told the Old Testament is all about, right? To be an example to us. Problem is, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. That's why the history of the foundation of America, the history of our religious liberty is so important, because there are things we don't want to repeat. Unfortunately, we don't teach this history, and in situations, in politics, in government, in society, I see Christians walking down a path we don't want to retrod. That's why we have this mission to bring this truth to you today. Our religious liberty is recognized in the Constitution of the United States, more specifically in the First Amendment of our Bill of Rights. We have three foundational documents, obviously, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment is where we find the principles of religious liberty. There are some people that say that the phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It absolutely is in the Constitution. It is religious liberty that requires the principle of separation of church and state. The problem that we have today is that we've been teaching the wrong definition of separation of church and state for a very long time. We're going to fix that today. But history teaches us the wisdom that our drafters had in putting first things first. Remember, the First Amendment is where we have religious liberty. But also, religious liberty is first in the First Amendment. Now, I teach a history class on the history of the Constitution, how it was written, where our principles come from as a whole. And that history begins in 1014. I actually have this book right here that I brought with me. This is the history that contains 5 documents written over 700 years. And without these 5 written documents, we wouldn't have a Declaration of Independence or a Constitution or a Bill of Rights. How many of you just name off somebody that you remember having heard wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, a founder of America? Patrick Henry, George Washington, John Hancock, right? You ever thought about the fact that all of these people were not Americans? You realize that before July 1776, there were no Americans. And before July of 1776, everybody who lived in the American colonies were actually British. Little funny trivia. Paul Revere, remember the ride of Paul Revere? He didn't ride through the towns yelling the British are coming, because that would have been ridiculous. Paul Revere was British, right? He was yelling the regulars are coming, because that's how they described the British Army. But this history that teaches us about first things first comes in the history that created those 5 documents that wrote our Constitution, our Declaration, and our Bill of Rights. The first of those documents is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties, written by a king named Henry I. And I want you to see, this promise in the 1100 Charter of Liberties was a promise from a king to his subjects that its government would never be evil and oppressive to the people ever again. I'm sure you didn't know that didn't last very long, right? But in that promise, the very first promise Henry makes is that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. He says, through the fear of God and the love which I have toward you all, in the first place, make the holy church of God free. This is the definition of separation of church and state. The definition of separation of church and state is that the government has no business in the influence of your church. When government is in your church, influencing, funding, and doing your religious activities, a king in 1100 realized that that was the definition of an evil and oppressive government. The second document in the history of our Constitution is this Magna Carta of 1215. And again, in the preamble, first things being first, reiterating and expanding this idea of separation of church and state being the key to liberty. Starting off, in the first place, we have granted of God, and by this our present charter confirmed for us, and our heirs forever, not just for us, but for our posterity. The church will be free from government intrusion. Now, the crazy thing about deals with kings is that kings will make deals with you. But history teaches that a king will only keep a deal, only keep a promise, as long as you hold a sword at the king's throat. But the minute you drop the sword, the kings go back to being kings and people going back to being people and subjects. and human nature kicks in, right? You all know a guy named Solomon, right? Nobody actually knows him, right? Nobody here that old, right? Solomon said there is nothing new under the sun. Why? Because human nature never changes, and we're always doing the same stupid stuff over and over again. So in this history, we have kings making promises, but there is a continual struggle. A continual struggle with the people trying to maintain a limited government to have their liberty from God. And in this struggle, we get to meet a beautiful woman by the name of Jenny Geddes. Now, Jenny Geddes is part of Great Britain now, and she lives in Scotland in 1639. Jenny Geddes is so familiar with her liberty, so familiar with the promise of the king, that she gets irritated at the continual force of government through her pastor's mouth. She gets sick and tired of hearing the government's orders as if they were the word of God. She gets so fed up one day, she stands up in church, picks up her stool, and throws it at the pulpit, condemning the pastor for being a hireling of men rather than a man of God. Now, this is actually an engraving of that riot that she causes in the church, which spreads out into the streets and goes throughout the entire kingdom, creating a period of history called the Bishop Wars of 1639. Now, these Bishop Wars are the people once again fighting for religious liberty in the church, because the king has appointed the leadership of the church rather than God. And the bishops are telling the people that to disobey the king is to disobey God himself. You realize that actually puts the king above God, meaning that everything that the king says is holy. And they knew in 1639 that that was a violation of liberty. This history brings us to the final document in the history of our Constitution. This is the 5th document. It's called the English Bill of Rights, where a king by the name of James II decides that he's going to be a magnanimous king, a very loving, endearing king, the greatest king that the people will ever know. And he decides once and for all that he's going to give the people religious liberty. So what he does is he issues a decree, which is another name for a law that is created by the king, called the Declaration of Indulgence. And in this Declaration of Indulgence, the king says, you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want, preach anything you want, on one condition. The law says that before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, and what will be said. And, according to the law, you must promise that you will never say anything bad about the king in church. Now raise your hand if you think that sounds like religious liberty. Obviously not. But let's bring that principle home for just a second. How many of you think that sounds like what we call today a 501c3? It's exactly a 501c3. I practiced First Amendment law for several years. And when our churches are actually deceived into thinking that they have to have permission from the IRS to be a church, because churches don't have to have 501c3 classification to be tax-deductible entities. That's a pretty new development in America. It came through the Johnson Amendment. Churches don't have to have 501c3s, because in America, we have separation of church and state, which says that churches are automatically tax exempt. Your tithe is automatically tax exempt if you give it to a church, whether they're a 501c3 or not. But for the last few decades, our churches and our church leaders have been deceived into thinking they have to have one of these papers from the IRS in order to be churches. And then when you fill out your form to get permission from the government to be a church, you have to tell them where you're meeting. You have to tell them who will be preaching. You got to give them the list of the board of directors. If the IRS questions your status as a church, you have to be willing to give up your sermons and prove what you're preaching. And most of our church leaders, most of our church people, actually believe that they can't talk about government in church. And that's simply not true. But here we have the American people built on a deep and settled history of government intrusion being evil and oppressive in churches, repeating a history because we failed to teach it. So now I want to bring you to religious liberty on our continent, because this is going to erupt into another revolution. Brings us the fifth document, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. But let me ask you a question. How many of you remember hearing that the Pilgrims came to America searching for religious liberty? Right? Yeah? Okay. It's not true. The Pilgrims were not coming to America searching for religious liberty. They came fleeing religious persecution. There's a difference. And that difference is evidenced by what those people did when they got here. Because you see, when they got here, they did not establish religious liberty as a principle of the people or government. What they actually established was government-chartered religions. So the original colonies had government-mandated religion. So if you lived in the colony, you had to practice that religion, punishable by law if you did not. Now before we get to, kicking them in the pants, right? Let's just remember that some lessons are long and hard learned, right? And what they know is we lived here and our government was persecuting and prosecuting us for our religious beliefs. Now we're over here and we're in charge. We have an opportunity to create a government where we won't be persecuted. What's the best thing we can do? Well, the best thing we can do is make the government our religion. So if we put our government, or our religion in our government, then our government will never persecute or prosecute us. But there's a problem with that, isn't there? Because as governments change administrations, so do ideologies, right? So you might have a Christian president today and a Muslim president tomorrow, right? Well, they have that idea already settled, right? How are we going to stop the administration from changing our ideology and then using the sword that we put in their hand to protect us to actually cut us down? So they created these things called Test Act oaths, which said that everybody who runs for office must take an oath of loyalty to the government's religion. If they will not take an oath of loyalty to the government's religion, then they can't run for office. Now the idea is, if they take an oath of loyalty to the government religion, when they get into office, then they won't change the religion to something else and use the force of government against us. And I suppose they believe that politicians always keep their oaths, right? You're laughing because you know human nature, right?
Yeah.
Well, let me suggest to you that maybe a politician taking an oath of loyalty to the chartered religion wasn't always such a nefarious thing, breaking that promise. Let me introduce you to a man named Obadiah Holmes, because I want you to remember that practicing the religion of the government was not a friendly suggestion, right? Oh, welcome to Massachusetts. We're so happy that you came. Here's a brochure for our church right up on the hill. We'd love to see you on Sunday. We've got a great kids program. No, that's not how it went. Welcome to Massachusetts. There's our church on the hill. We'll see you in church on Sunday, or we'll see you in prison on Monday. That's how it worked. So Obadiah Holmes and his people found themselves in a charter that was not their religion. Now it takes a great deal of sacrifice to get from one continent to another in the late 1600s, early 1700s. So these people have spent everything that they have, and they're stuck where they land until they can get the means to move on, which means they have a choice they have to make. Do they follow the law and violate their conscience? Or do they follow their conscience and violate the law? They choose to follow their conscience, and they have church in secret. One day somebody turns them in. The constable comes and knocks on the door. Mr. Holmes, are you preaching outside the chartered religion? Yes, we are. Obadiah Holmes and 3 ministers were arrested and thrown into prison. Obadiah Holmes was beaten so severely that he had to spend an entire week on his hands and knees, because that was the only way he could be relieved of the pain. Everything that you and I would do on a week's time, he did everything on his hands and knees. What was his crime? Worshiping God according to his own conscience. I'll introduce you to another name, Mary Dyer. You see, Massachusetts had a law that said if any shipment were to import a Quaker into Massachusetts, the shipment would be immediately arrested and the Quaker would be hung. Mary Dyer refused to renounce her conscience, her belief in Christ, and she was hung for it. Now, this is not the history of Iran, China, Iraq, or Syria. This is the history of Americans on American soil, Christians persecuting, prosecuting, executing Christians in the name of denominational differences. Can you see why we wouldn't maybe want to learn this and teach our children this kind of history? But remember, the history you don't know is the history you're doomed to repeat. In the last presidential election, we had a presidential candidate talking about the problem with refugees coming to America, some of them being terrorists, some of them being Muslim, Islamic terrorists. And during the debate, he suggested that we should have a test for anyone coming in the country to determine if they were Christians or not. Anybody remember that? Now, my husband and I were watching, and my husband, being a pastor, sort of chuckled. He said, wow, I'd like to have a copy of that test, because then maybe I could determine who in my church was actually a Christian or not, right? Come on now, you know what I'm talking about. But I was nearly in tears, because I knew this history. And so many people clapped and thought, that's a great idea. And I thought, can we take that to step 2? Because so many things sound great in step 1. But step 2, who's going to write the test? Who's going to be in charge of enforcing the test? Who's going to determine the punishment for failing the test? Who's going to execute that punishment? Because it's not going to be your pastor doing any of that. It's going to be some agent and some agency elected by no one. And then which denomination of Christianity will he use as a standard? Because those who do not know their history can think some really bad ideas are good ones. This is why we're learning today these course objectives, so that we don't end up repeating the history that drove our founders to say, look, we've got to have religious liberty as a matter of law, not just a matter of understanding. You see, we know where our religious liberty comes from, right? It comes from God. And it's a lesson that we've learned throughout history. We've learned throughout history what happens when government gets in control of religion. Christians die. Innocence dies. What about this idea of a Christian nation? You've heard that. America's a Christian nation. I fear that we use that term errantly, which number one gives the wrong impression to non-believers, but gives the wrong authority to believers. Again, going to the history, the people who created America. This man is John Leland. John Leland is the reason we have the First Amendment and the entire Bill of Rights. John Leland was the pastor of his church, but he was also the leader of a very powerful political group in Virginia called the Virginia Baptist General Convention. Now, the Virginia Baptist General Convention controlled the politics in Virginia at the time of the creation and the ratification of our Constitution. Not only that, the people of Virginia were direct lineage of those who were escaping the colonies that were enforcing government-mandated religion. So they had a direct relationship with this government persecution thing. And so it was Leland, through the Virginia Baptist General Convention, that the First Amendment of part of religious liberty was incorporated into the Bill of Rights. This notion of a Christian nation, Leland says, must be very specifically understood. You cannot believe that America as a Christian nation means that Christianity is preferred as a matter of government above all other religions. You cannot believe that as a Christian nation that means that Americans simply tolerate other religions, but it's Christianity first as a matter of government. Why? Because if you tolerate something, it's temporary, isn't it? There's always an end to your toleration, isn't there? And when government tolerates something, the end of that toleration comes at the end of a sword, doesn't it? Look at what he says. Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely and see that one does not abuse another. He says the liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians, because if we make a law that outlaws certain religions today, what happens when those in that religion are in control tomorrow? Because you don't wipe out beliefs. As a matter of fact, Christians should know firsthand that persecution doesn't end a faith, it increases it. He gives us the biblical principle of religious liberty, which should teach us the foundation of what America really is. You see, when we say things like Christian nation, we make unbelievers think that they're just simply tolerated in America. We make other religions believe they're simply tolerated in America. Then that's not liberty. A more correct way to describe America's foundation is that we are built on the Judeo-Christian worldview. Because it's the Judeo-Christian worldview that gives us the principles of liberty for all. Because God so loved the world that He created everyone to come to His Son. Right? And does the gospel need the government sword for its efforts? As a matter of fact, history proves quite the opposite. You see, we're built on the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. No other worldview gives you that. Hinduism doesn't give you that. Buddhism doesn't give you that. Islam doesn't give you that. Only Christianity gives you that. And unfortunately, I've worked with this idea of government-mandated religion for so long that I don't know if we realize it. We've actually allowed our government to choose a religion. They teach it in our public schools now. It's called humanism. Humanism is a religion, by the way. Don't let them tell you it's science. I was an atheist. I was an evolutionist. I was a biochemist. I know what that ideology is. And humanism does not teach that all men are created equal. They teach quite the opposite. That the only reason you're sitting here in this chair listening to me speak and not swinging from your tail from a tree is because you lucked out in the evolutionary process. The whole principle of humanism is based on natural selection, which is survival of the fittest. Look at what Leland tells us about this Judeo-Christian worldview. Every man must give an account of himself to God. Therefore, every man ought to be free to serve God the best way he can reconcile it to his conscience. Now, we must recognize that having the liberty to serve God also entails the liberty to not serve God. He says, if government can stand before God on that day of judgment, let them control men in what they believe. But if not, men must be free to believe as their conscience dictates. You know, that's the Judeo-Christian world principle, that all people, no matter what you believe, will stand before God one day and you will answer for the things that you've done and the things that you have not done. And what Leland's simply saying is, if on that day they can push you aside and say, hey God, I was president when Krisanne was living. Pay no attention to how she lived her life. You know, if she did anything you didn't want her to do, take it out on me instead. Because after all, she was just submitting herself to the authority that had been placed over her, right? But you know that's not possible, right? That day is personal. That day is individual. So we can't be told by government what we can and cannot believe. That's the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what we mean by a Christian nation. That we are built on principles that liberty is a gift from God. Not that Christianity has preeminence over anyone else. This notion of a Christian nation drove us to believe that religious liberty for all, not just for us, but for ages and millions yet unborn, be incorporated as the first part of the First Amendment. How did we lose sight of these principles of separation of church and state? How did we come to believe that Thomas Jefferson wrote separation of church and state, invented separation of church and state in his letter to the Danbury Baptists? Because we failed to teach the primary roots of our history. Not only that, we're raising up generations of people to hate their own country because they have no idea the liberty that it's based upon. See, Thomas Jefferson had just been elected President of the United States, and the Danbury Baptists were congratulating him for becoming President because they endorsed him. They wanted him to be President. But they're writing him a sort of housekeeping letter. We're so happy that you've become President of the United States. We were happy to endorse you. But now that you're President, we just want to make sure that you're not going to flip-flop on us. And we want you to know we're watching you. Jefferson responds very humbly and sincerely and says, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. See, Jefferson's history was the 1100 Charter of Liberties, the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, all of these 5 documents, which was the same history of the Danbury Baptists. So Jefferson's just speaking them in a historical commonality. I'm not going to become a tyrannical king. You see, Jefferson had made a stand before he ran for president in the name of religious liberty that caught the Danbury Baptists' eye. You see, shortly after we ratified the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, several legislators got together to create a piece of legislation called a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. Now the idea is, we're going to collect a property tax from everybody to teach the Christian religion to all the people. Because we believe that the Christian religion has a higher moral standard. And that moral standard will lead to a better society. Now the interesting thing is Thomas Jefferson was vehemently opposed to this piece of legislation. Why? He says to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he just believes is sinful and tyrannical. So you're collecting a tax from everybody to pay the teachers to teach the Christian religion. And Jefferson is writing an entire treatise on why this is wrong. And he asks, which Christianity is going to be taught? Because you're going to be collecting money from everybody to teach it. Are the Baptists going to pay for the Catholic version? Are the Catholics going to pay for the Pentecostal version? Are the Jews or the Turks going to pay for any version? He says, if you're going to take money from them through the force of government called taxation and fund something they don't believe in, that's tyrannical. But he also said it's sinful. Because the Bible specifically teaches us how the church is supposed to be governed internally. The body of the church controls the leadership of the church. And if the leadership of the church goes off the rails, the body of the church is to entreat the leadership, correct them. If the leadership will not be corrected, then they're to be replaced. Right? Matthew 18. But Jefferson says, when you have government paying the leadership of the church to teach the Christian religion, then the body of the church is cut out of the governance of the church, because now the funding comes from the government, which means the control comes from the government, and the people will no longer have control over their church. And then you don't have a biblical church. And that's sinful. James Madison, 4th President of the United States, author, contributor, and father of our Constitution, also wrote a remonstrance against this piece of legislation. Look what he says. Collecting a tax to pay Christian teachers implies that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth. How many of you want your mayor to determine your religious truth? How about your governor? How about the Attorney General of the United States? How about any president? No. Because you see, when government decides what kind of religion is going to be taught, then government employs religion as an engine of civil policy, which is the sword. He says that government paying for the teaching of religion is an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation. Why? because it teaches that government is your provider, your protector, and your salvation, and not faith in Christ alone. The Danbury Baptists were also opposed to this piece of legislation. They said it is believed to be repugnant to the spirit of the gospel for the legislatures to proceed in matters of religion. Repugnant to the spirit of the gospel. What does that mean? Well, it's the same thing that Jesus said to Nicodemus. If I told you of earthly things and you believe me not, how shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? Let's look at this really quickly. Are we not told to train up our child in the way that they shall go? Do you know that's a principle that works both ways? You train up your child in the way of God, and that's the way that they will go. But if you train up your child in the way of government, then that's the way they will go as well. So we have to ask our Christian brothers and sisters who are training up our children, the people of God or the people of government? Are we all supposed to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? And then Matthew chapter 6 teaches us, look at the sparrow in the tree. He doesn't worry, he doesn't toil. Look at the grass in the field today, gone tomorrow. Here, look at the lily in the valley. Even Solomon was never dressed in such an array. How much more will your Father in heaven provide for you? Oh, ye of little faith, as if the sparrow has more than we do. Isn't that what he's saying? He says, when you worry about how you're going to fund things that I'm going to tell you to do, you look like a non-believer. And that's why it says, seek ye first the government and its benefits, and all these things will be added unto you. I'm just making sure you guys are paying attention still. Right? God says, come to me. Problem is, if Christians are going to government for all their needs, the message they're sending to the believer, to the non-believers, is that God is bankrupt and he needs a government bailout. So when we bring them the gospel that God is sufficient for their heavenly needs, how will they ever believe us that he's sufficient when we teach them that he's insufficient for our earthly needs? Finishing up here. Should the legislature assume the right of taxing the people for the support of the gospel, it will be destructive to religious liberty. Why would government paying teachers to teach a Christian religion, which would teach liberty, we would assume, be destructive to the gospel? Why? Because they knew those who the government employs in its service will have a right to regulate and dictate to. So when your paycheck comes from the government, even though they call it tax dollars, how many of you think the government believes our tax dollars are our money? No, it's theirs. They will dictate. That's why we know the effects of government in religious activities. Wouldn't that be the same as tax subsidies in our churches? Wouldn't that be the same as government grant programs in your churches? Putting government in control of you and your beliefs? What about school vouchers? School vouchers is exactly the payment of Christian teachers with tax dollars. Sinful and tyrannical, Jefferson called that. But putting government in charge of your church. Because it won't be long before the government dictates the curriculum you teach in order to keep your money. And this is why we teach this history. Because we are supposed to be preserving religious liberty, seeking his kingdom first, not government benefits. We don't need a 501c3. Our tithes don't come from the little old lady in the pew. Our tithes come from God. We don't need government benefits. We need God. We need truth, and we need liberty. And that's why history is so important. Because it's a lesson that we've lost. How many of you learned something this morning?
A very special thank you to Krisanne Hall for that wonderful presentation. If you would like more information about membership, licensure, or certifications with FACT, please visit our website, facct93.com, or feel free to give our office a call.